Poštovane dame i gospodo, uvaženi panelisti, veliko mi je zadovoljstvo što mogu da vam se obratim i predstavim četvrtu online konferenciju Arhitektura na raskršću. Online konferencije su uvod u dvodnevni interdisciplinarni regionalni forum eksperata, mladih istraživača i vizualnih umetnika ŠumArt, koji je planiran za septembar mesec 2022. godine. Forum je mesto na kome će se razmenjivati ideje i iskustva sa ciljem podsticanja intenzivnijeg angažovanja mladih ljudi u oblasti kulture i umetnosti. Današnja tema je jako zanimljiva, a za razumevanje procesa i izazova sa kojima se susreće arhitektura 21. veka započelo bi sa pokušajem davanja odgovora na pitanje da li se dogodio određeni revolucionarni događaj koji se odigrao u samom jezgru umetnosti. Razmišljajući upravo o umetničkim stremljenjima novog milenijuma, arhitekta James Lowe je rekao: građevine 21. veka biće sasvim drugačije od zgrada 20. veka. One nisu od betona, čelika i stakla, već od novih netaknutih materijala, multimedijalne, interaktivne tehnologije. Arhitektura će doći do nove forme svetlosti, cyberture. Sa druge strane, zelena arhitektura Zahe Hadid, Mozarta savremene arhitekture po mišljenju mnogih teoretičara umetnosti, osmišljena je tako da se koriste ne samo prirodni oblici, već i resursi, sunčeva svetlost, kišnica, ekonomična ventilacija, ekološki materijali i sl. A kada govorimo o arhitekturi kao vizualnoj umetnosti, moramo naglasiti da svako delo u sebi pre svega sadrži određeni smisao kako bi mogli da ga čitamo kao artefakt određenog značenja. Sredstva kojima se najpre značenje gradi, a koje su podložna transformacijama, kao i usmeravanje i razumevanje poruka, odnosno dekodiranje, koje arhitektonsko delo nosi, imaju za savremenu arhitekturu i za same arhitekte veoma značajnu ulogu. Se prožimajući minimalizam u arhitekturi kao paradigma arhitekture 21. veka, predstavlja traganje za suštinom koje se nalazi u nesvodljivom minimumu. Nadahnuta upotreba arhitektonskih celina, kao što su arhetipski elementi, kroz fantazmu ideje, a nešto toga možemo vidjeti u radovima gore spomenutih arhitekata i mnogih drugih, preuzima najveću odgovornost za davanje identiteta objektu, jer učestvuje u formiranju njegovog jezika i zbog toga i razumevanju fluidnog prostora oslobođenog potrebe za dopunjavanjem. Upravo ovaj svedeni jezik arhitekture 21. veka odgovara dobu obeleženom elektronskim komunikacijama, što bi mogao biti jedan od odgovora na gore pomenuto pitanje. Pojava laika kao mere estetske vrednosti inherentno je rastućem trendu, što vešto korespondira sa evidentnom karakteristikom savremene umetnosti. Prva se tiče toga da se od umetnosti zahteva da bude neprekidno medijski prisutna, ali, drugim rečima, da njena vrednost koja u određenom momentu je aktualna može u narednom periodu biti značajno fluktuirana. Drugi problem se odnosi na pitanje da li arhitekta, kao i ostali umetnici 21. veka, ima ulogu, odnosno dobija ulogu i postaje predmet pretvaranja u medijsku zvezdu sa ograničenim rokom trajanja ili pak ostaje anoniman unutar arhitektonskih biroa. Ništa manje značajno je i pitanje sve veće potrebe, odnosno sve više izraženi trend ponovnog otkrivanja i reafirmacije javnih prostora o teme oblikovanja, dizajniranja novih sadržaja do sve značajnije uloge javnih prostora kao javne scene, pokazatelja i modifikatora stanja socijalne sredine. O ovim i mnogim drugim izazovima sa kojima se susreće savremena arhitektura govore naši večerašnji panelisti. Prvo bih predstavila dame, a ne po redu izlaganja. Gospođa dr. Bo Hanley Jokić, istoričarka umetnosti, sa temom Portavilion, Commissioning Contemporary Visual Art in the Public Domain, dr. Iva Čukić, Ministarstvo prostora, ko-osnivač Ministarstva prostora i predavač na Departmentu za urbanizam na Tehničkom fakultetu u Berlinu. Teme su savremena arhitektonska produkcija u Srbiji, uzroci i posledice, viđeno iz ugla žirija 44. Salona arhitekture, urbanističko planiranje u Beogradu i uloga obrazovanja u arhitekturi. Doktorand gospođa Jelena Gačić-Ivanov, tema arhitektura Zlatibora, od zamisli arhitekte Jovanke Jeftanović do masovne urbanizacije, profesor dr. Nenad Perić, programski direktor ŠumArt, redovni profesor nauka i redovni profesor umetnosti Instituta za srpsku kulturu i Fakulteta društvenih nauka, tema Beograd putovanje kroz vreme. Diskusiju će moderirati gospođica Nataša, moje drage koleginice, Nataša Tapić i Smiljka Čabraja, mlade istoričarke umetnosti. Teme će biti izlagane na srpskom i engleskom jeziku. Ja bih sad zamolila Smiljku da se obrati na engleskom. Hvala.
Ja ću sad zvanično da pročitam i na engleskom jeziku uvodnu reč. Ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, it is my great pleasure to present the fourth online conference, Challenges of the Contemporary Momentum. The online conferences are announcements to the two-day interdisciplinary regional forum of experts, young researchers, and visual artists called ŠumArt, planned for September 2022. A forum is a place for exchanging ideas and experiences to encourage more intensive engagement of young people in culture and art. Understanding the processes and challenges facing 21st century architecture would begin with answering whether a particular revolutionary event took place at the very core of art. Thinking about the artistic achievements of the new millennium, architect James Law, Cybertecture International, once said the 21st century buildings will be completely different from the 20th century buildings. They are not made of concrete, steel, and glass, but of new intact materials, multimedia, and interactive technology. The architecture will come to a new form of light, cybertecture. On the other hand, Zaha Hadid's green architecture, a Mozart of modern architecture to many architectural theorists, is designed not to use only natural forms, but also resources, sunlight, rainwater, economical ventilation, and environmental materials. When we talk about architecture as a visual art, we must emphasize that every creation contains a certain meaning that we can read as an artifact of an evident meaning. The criteria by which it is built can be subject to transformations, as well as the direction of understanding the messages that an architectural work carries, and have an important role in contemporary architecture. As a paradigm of 21st century architecture, minimalism in architecture is a search for the essence at its base. An inspired use of architectural units through the apparition of the idea, which we can see in the works of the above-mentioned architects, takes the greatest responsibility for giving identity to the object because it participates in the formation of its language and understanding the fluidity of space. This reduced language of architecture corresponds to the age marked by electronic communications, which could be one of the answers to the question. The emergence of like as a measure of aesthetic value is inherent in the growing trend of the era, which skillfully corresponds to the evident characteristics of 21st century contemporary art. The first is that the art is required to be constantly present in the media, but also dual. In other words, that its value, which is currently present, can fluctuate significantly in the future. The second problem concerns whether an architect becomes the subject of transformation into a media star with a limited lifespan or remains anonymous with architectural bureaus. No less important is the trend of rediscovery and reaffirmation of public spaces, the issue of design and new content to the increasingly important role of public spaces as public scenes, indicators and modifiers of the social environment becomes the issues of growing need. Our tonight's panelists talk about these and many other challenges that contemporary architecture faces. We would like to introduce the ladies first, not in the order of presentation. Dr. Bo Hanley Jokić, art historian, coordinator of international projects and corporation ŠumArt. Topic Portavilion, commissioning contemporary visual art in the public domain. Dr. Iva Čukić, Ministry of Spatial Planning and lecturer at the Department of Urbanism at the Technical Faculty in Berlin. Topics contemporary architectural production in Serbia, causes and consequences, seen from the point of view of the jury of the 44th Salon of Architecture. urban planning in Belgrade and the role of education in architecture. PhD student Jelena Simić, topic Architecture of Zlatibor, from the ideas of architect Jovanka Jeftanović to mass urbanization. Professor Dr. Nenad Perić, Program Director of ŠumArt, full Professor of Science and Arts, Institute of Serbian Culture and Faculty of Social Sciences, with topic Belgrade Time Travel. The discussion is moderated by Ms. Nataša Tapić and Smilka Čabraja, art historians. Themes are presented in Serbian and English.
Sada bih pozvala gospođu dr. Bo Hanley Jokić da predstavi svoj rad. Bo, the panel is all yours.
I'm just wondering, I have a slide presentation. Is it possible?
Okay.
On my screen?
Share.
I can start now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That would be great. Can you see it?
No. Something happened.
Okay.
Please share.
I want to try again. Okay, hold on. 1 second. Oops. Just 1 sec. Okay, let's see if this works. Maybe I can do this in opposite order. Okay, now let's try. Is it coming up now?
No.
I've tried I'm getting a message that says host disabled, attendee screen sharing. Can you?
Yeah, I will, let me see.
I think if you go to the host, to the attendee's name, you can click down in order to allow screen share, maybe on an individual basis.
I will make you as a host.
That's perfect. Yeah,
okay.
That's gonna work. Okay, let's see. Okay.
Okay.
Can you see now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Perfect. Okay. Are you able to see now? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So first, I'd like to thank you, Jelena, for hosting this event and also for the invitation to speak on this topic, and also to all of you for attending today. This event has actually given me a chance to reconsider and re-experience a project that I worked on quite some time ago, and to re-engage with the work of 4 artists whose works I deeply admire and who have all respectively gone on to do many subsequent significant exhibitions since. So this has been a really enriching process so far. So today my talk will consist of the following: an introduction to Portavilion, the project itself, the intentions and motivations and objectives behind this project. I will then move on to discuss the artists involved in their works. Then I will discuss the public reception of the project, and finally discuss its legacy. But prior to this, I want to begin by discussing the main theme of tonight's discussion, which has to do with the challenges and future directions of contemporary architecture. It strikes me that when we speak about architecture, we are in fact really speaking about everything. We are discussing the fabric, structure, and context of life. As many of you will be aware, the term architect comes from the Latin word architectus, which comes from the Greek architekton, which broken down into 2 parts is archi, meaning to be the first, and tekton, to build or to make. The origins of the Greek Latin meanings of the term architect are very telling, as they set up the architect as a kind of visionary or god, whose role is to produce unique designs and buildings that will transform and improve the built environment, and in doing so to manifest the structural world as we know it. And yet, no man is in fact God and has the power to see the future, and hence the architect is building for a hypothetical world, a future world which he or she is not privy to and perhaps may never see. This simple fact underpins many historical and contemporary problems in architecture, which I do not unfortunately have time in this short lecture to explore in depth, but which are nonetheless important to mention as they underpin the theme of tonight's discussion. And so naturally, in examining the challenges of the contemporary momentum through the lens of architecture, it is impossible to isolate this discipline and its creations from the many interconnected social structures in which it sits, in particular from the concerns of city planning, environmental issues, pollution, energy, trade, business, health, and disease. But most importantly, we cannot disconnect these issues from those occupants for which urban spaces were originally created to serve, for the communities of citizens which work and live in them. In a sense, by examining evolving issues in contemporary architecture and urban planning, we are forced to consider many larger existential problems, which relate to the human dimension, which is an area of significant interest of mine. We are in fact examining human behavior, consumption, and the way indeed our expectations and perceptions about life manifest in a physical form, and what consequences these manifestations have for the future. This is also what makes this discipline so exceptional and so important, as architectural works in the material form of buildings are often perceived as cultural symbols and works of art, and in so doing reflect not only the technological prowess and innovation of a society, but indeed the social psychology of a people at a given place and time. It is perhaps with this in mind that the French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault wrote on the problems of modern architecture that, and I quote, "Architecture functions within a system in which power is exercised with no particular moral intent," end of quote. He goes on to say that liberty is a practice, so there may in fact always be a certain number of projects. Oops, let me minimize this, sorry. Oops, I'm just going back. There may in fact always be a certain number of projects whose aim is to, I can't get this completely, I'm blocked by my, I don't know how to do that. Constraints to loosen or even to break them, but none of these projects can simply by its nature as such will have the liberty automatically that will be established by the project itself. The liberty of men, unfortunately, this is not allowing me to, I'm sorry, to, no, I can't actually see my quote. Okay, that's better. Liberty is a practice, so there may in fact always be a certain number of projects whose aim is to modify some constraints, to loosen or even to break them. But none of these projects can, simply by its nature, assure that people will have liberty automatically. That will be established by the project itself. The liberty of men is never assured by the institutions and laws that are intended to guarantee them. This is why almost all of these laws and institutions are quite capable of being turned around. I think that architecture can and does produce positive effects when the liberating intentions of the architect coincide with the real practices of people in the exercise of their freedom. Okay, going back. Yet so often current models of urban architecture, design, and city planning are based on unlimited expansion of the city, a premise which in and of itself presents significant problems for health of human beings and wildlife. This model of continuous expansion is in direct opposition to the idea of the citizen and his or her basic needs, and by consequence, as Foucault emphasizes, for liberty. As cities continue to grow under exclusively profit-driven models of expansion or collapse, the needs of the individual and his or her experience and ability to live in a healthy environment are superseded. This causes us to question the original model and purpose of the city, which has morphed over time into something that does not resemble its origins. And in doing so, the human dimension has been eaten away at to a point that it has to an extent consumed its original function. This calls on us as a society to rethink the notion of the city, and in doing so, as earlier noted, to consider our role in relation to it and to better understand our genuine needs as a society. As Michel Foucault so eloquently proposed, quote, maybe the target nowadays is not to discover what we are, but to refuse what we are. An inquiry which will of course be in turn manifested in the future design and architecture produced, and which may help to draw us closer to the source of many challenges that we are facing as a society in terms of the way we live and interact within the built environment. So with this in mind, I have elected to speak about a particular project that I worked on which has emphasized this precise tension, the tension that exists between the current model of corporate-driven architecture and the citizen. It is noteworthy to emphasize that I come from a visual art background, and that this position, and that is the position I will be approaching this subject from, not per se from an architectural one. And there are, of course, notable differences. And the project was called Portavilion, and it was conceived by Emma Underhill, a curator and colleague of mine, for the City of London in 2008. It was an ambitious project that straddled the lines between contemporary visual art, sculpture, urbanism, architecture, with the main purpose of introducing works in the public domain that would celebrate urban green spaces, and in doing so could have a significant legacy both for the artists involved and local and visiting communities to the city. And also, more importantly, because I believe this is a project that could lend itself well to the context of Belgrade or Serbia, or more ambitiously to the region, based on the kinds of recent policy incentives I see emerging here, which seem to suggest greater interest in tourism and the development of cultural networks across the region. In particular, as we are discussing architecture, which is embedded within the civic sphere, and its influence and implications going forward into the future, I've selected this project because it speaks less about challenges in isolation and more about the possibilities that current challenges offer us as architects, historians, academics, policymakers, curators, and artists. It is my hope that by showcasing public artworks of this kind and discussing these ideas, that this will encourage the possibility of creating new interventions which encourage the celebration of green spaces, art, and culture by attracting new audiences, raising awareness of policymakers, by uniting communities, and igniting ideas that may disturb current models and lead to more visionary projects, both in terms of how we perceive and utilize urban public space. The ways in which we live and function as a society leave marks on memory and have very real implications for the future. So another reason I chose to discuss this project is that I believe this was a very important theme or feature for the artists involved, and underpins their intentions for the artworks they produced, all of which were very much premised on the idea of the citizen and the individual's experience of the city. In this way, these works became a kind of symbol of counter-capitalism, which was in contrast to current trends in state-functional civic buildings in Britain, as the works became more about the unique connection between the individual viewer, urban green spaces, and the city more generally. First, I would like to talk a little bit about the concept of Portavilion. As the title of the project explicitly articulates, Portavilion sought to commission artists to create unique, portable, or temporary pavilions for a series of parks across central London. As you may be aware, the term has a strong historical reference in the United Kingdom, being that many of the contemporary visual arts festivals and events which celebrate art and culture have made use of pavilions, dating back to the 1851 Centenary Pavilion created for the Festival of Britain on the South Bank in London. And of course, there have been many other market examples since, including the biannual commissions for respective pavilions at the Venice Biennale, which British artists are invited every other year to exhibit alongside their European colleagues. So the title of the project was one of the only prescriptive parameters of the brief given to the participating artists outside of the sites themselves. It is important to mention this, as you will certainly see this visibly reflected in the artworks discussed. Beyond this, the intentions for the project were that Portavilion was a public art project that was conceived for and took place in London in the summer of 2008. The project was premised on the commissioning of 4 site-specific artworks by 4 established artists, which formed a walking trail exhibition connecting different parks across London's city boroughs. In joining these green spaces vis-a-vis 4 unique site-specific artworks, the project simultaneously drew attention and celebrated the importance of urban green space and its impact on the quality of urban life for the individual citizen. The artworks also in turn created a backdrop for various cultural events and performances, which were inspired by the 4 commissioned works and took place in the 4 respective parks. And these are listed here. So, the artists selected for the project were 4 very established artists, including Toby Patterson, Monika Seznaska, Anika Ericsson, and Dan Graham, all of whom had international portfolios at the time of this project. This is not, however, I want to emphasize, a mandatory feature of the project. Of course, a project such as this could also be achieved with younger emerging artists, but being that it was the first show of Portavilion, the public profile of the artist certainly enhanced the publicity and audience interest in the exhibition. Oops. Sorry. Okay, here we go. So the first work I'd like to speak about is Toby Patterson's powder blue orthogonal pavilion created for Pottersfields Park on the South Bank. Like much of his work, was inspired by modernist architecture and introduced a new feature into the landscape of the park. Patterson's work in a variety of forms, works in a variety of forms, from large-scale sculptural assemblages and architectural wall drawings to small paintings on paper and perspex. Patterson's work emphasizes the integration of art and architecture. He is influenced by his personal experience of the built environment, with a particular focus on post-war architecture and an interest in the processes of abstraction within visual art. Reference points for this work included the light, airy features of the 1951 Festival of Britain, and in particular structures such as Erno Goldfinger's kiosk designs and the Regatta restaurant, and designs by Basil Spence, Bertold Lubetkin, and Frederick Kiesler, as well as other more traditional park architecture such as bandstands and kiosks. Patterson remarked that the ostensibly functionless nature of the pavilion was really intriguing for him, particularly the notion of a building existing as nothing more than an exposition of itself, with its possible or potential uses hinted at but not ultimately interpretable. Patterson's powder blue orthogonal pavilion imposes a natural dialogue between the environment, the surrounding architecture, and the elements of sky, water, natural light, and space. The work is at once both adherent with the imposing structural landscape and the organic features of the environment in which it is set. Toby mentioned to me in an interview I had with him following the exhibition that a central inspiration for the work was that he really intended to create a contrast with the surrounding architecture on the South Bank. In particular, the Snail, or London City Hall, designed by Norman Foster, which is, if you've ever visited London, an incredibly unwelcoming, impenetrable black dome. It's of course a civic building to be for the purpose of the people, and is supposed to be a public building with an obvious sort of civic purpose. Yet in reality, it is one of the most uninviting and inaccessible buildings in London. So the light airiness characteristic of Patterson's powder blue orthogonal pavilion was in part a reaction to the Snail, but also intended to sit harmoniously in relation to other aspects of the landscape, such as HMS Belfast and the Tower Bridge. Moving on to the work of Monika Seznaska, who is one of Poland's leading contemporary artists and has in recent years attained international acclaim for her work. Her work has documented the ways personal memory, the transition of communism to capitalism in Poland through the destruction of modernist buildings from the previous era in order to make way for new developments. In a sense, her work shows the transition from homogeneous functional, structurally robust buildings to colorful, gated, inaccessible apartment blocks, which are economically unattainable for the average citizen living in Warsaw, where she lived and worked for many years. Conversely, her work for Portavilion, entitled The Wind House, was deeply influenced by the site of Primrose Hill, where people come to fly kites, and the structure of the work appears as if it had literally been sculpted by the wind. The form of the pavilion looked semi-deconstructed, the walls were bent and the roof mangled and squashed, appearing to have fallen down from the top of the hill. But rather than destroying an architectural building to make this, the structure was very carefully composed from small, multifaceted wooden shapes to create an immaculately crafted geometric form. Unlike most urban architecture, the Wind House served no function. Instead, it created a physical experience and an opportunity for the play of imagination. The manipulation of form, planes, and surfaces made you feel as though you had walked into a cardboard box that had been flattened or mangled by the wind. This is also reminiscent of an earlier epoch in London when school children would come to the park with cardboard boxes, which they used as sleds to slide down Primrose Hill. In this sense, the work is of homage to more innocent times when people allowed their children to stray in the city uninhibited and unafraid of the dangers. The next participating artist is Anika Ericsson, who is one of Sweden's most widely exhibited artists. She is interested in social structures and human behavior and often realizes her work through various kinds of collaborations. Her work manifests in a variety of forms, from films and performances to sculptures and installations, but a frequent starting point is the ever-shifting function of the city, its public spaces and inhabitants. Inspired by the contradiction between Regent's Park, originally a royal concept intended as a private estate for the wealthy, Ericsson explores the notion of free, what she calls free zones, producing and screening a range of short films that she made especially for the project, which portray the lesser known activities and reveal the hidden secrets of the history of Regent's Park, both past and present. The smallest cinema was conceived by Ericsson as a venue for films that she made about the park, but the mobile cinema pavilion itself, where the films were actually screened, was designed by a team of architects from Hopkins Architects. The cinema is mobile, it's a movable environment on wheels, and was relocated in different hiding spots around the park throughout the summer of 2008, so that visitors had to sort of venture deep into the park in order to find it. And once they did, the tiny cinema was able to house or seat only 6 viewers at a time, making it a kind of markedly discreet experience for visitors. Over the years, Ericsson has produced a large number of works in which the perception of time, structure of power, and once accepted social visions are called into question. Ericsson very intentionally toys with conflicting views around the public realm and the structures that regulate it, revealing urban changes and how these are subject to unexpected political shifts and mutations. So the tiniest cinema in the world for the wealthy and the good is an homage to public spaces that are in fact still free for everyone. The final artwork I will discuss tonight was a work made by Dan Graham, a very important and influential artist with a unique mind whose oeuvre spanned over 50 years and who very sadly passed away in February of this year. Graham was born in Illinois, USA in 1942 and lived and worked in New York for most of his life. He was one of the most important American artists of his generation. He first emerged in the 1960s alongside artists such as Dan Flavin and Sol LeWitt, and was one of the most influential pioneers of conceptual art. Graham's work has featured in 4 documentas, 1972, 77, 82, and 92, and has been exhibited in museums and galleries worldwide. triangular pavilion with circular cutout variation H, like many of Graham's pavilions, highlights the awkwardness that occurs when intimate moments or details are rudimentarily broadcast in an impersonal manner, as he continues to investigate the voyeuristic act of seeing oneself reflected whilst at the same time watching others. Graham described his pavilions as, quote, producing a sense of uneasiness and psychological alienation through a constant play between feelings of inclusion and exclusion. When walking around the work, it is actually, when you're there in the park, it is actually difficult to identify what the entry point actually, in fact, is. It plays on the idea of voyeurism as the work simultaneously frames the outside world while reduplicating itself. Spectators and visitors to the park are looking at you while you are looking out at them from inside the pavilion. The viewer, upon entering the pavilion, becomes part of the exhibition. The work allows the viewer, in this sense, a unique perspective of the garden, while other visitors passing by spectate on the individual inside of the sculptural pavilion. The scale is also interesting and somewhat claustrophobic, despite the fact that it is tall enough to house an adult man standing upright. And in an interview with Dan Graham, he noted that his interest in making pavilions in his work stems from his desire to create optical toys, spaces which are simultaneously about individual discovery, education, and entertainment. This arises from his interest in the urban environment and what he refers to as quote unquote street furniture, such as bus shelters and telephone booths made of steel and glass. He also discussed his interest in the objective gaze of the viewer, such as in Shakespeare's The Play Within the Play, where the spectator becomes at once both part of the work, a voyeur looking out at the world passing by, as well as the subject of voyeurism from the passing world looking in at him or her. The work in this sense becomes a playground or stage for the respective individual experience of each visitor, which is ever changing depending on the audiences who are visiting the park. Graham was also very interested in landscape architecture, which he perceived as fitting with a historical lineage, with the first museums in Europe being in fact Renaissance gardens. Graham's pavilions emphasize the dialectic between the city and nature, and in doing so draw upon a rich tradition of outdoor structures, the rustic hut, the 19th century gazebo, the temporary buildings built by de Stijl and by modern architects for expositions. Graham's pavilions nonetheless use the materials of contemporary urban architecture, such as two-way mirrored glass in his pavilions, both for the effects this material creates for spectators and also as a kind of parody or revolt against corporate architecture, which often makes use of these materials in order to isolate and conceal. Instead, Graham repurposes them in his work in order to create a participatory effect, which engages rather than isolates its users. This work as such draws together many of Graham's interests and inspirations and is very much about individuality and play. I can also talk to you a bit about some of the legacies of the project, but I'm aware of the time constraint, so I'm thinking maybe we should move on to the next lecture. But if you'd like, you can read through some of these at the end. There were some really important legacies in terms of the creation of the commissioned artworks themselves, the benefits, of course, to the artists, audience enhancement, and interest in both contemporary art, but also architecture and green spaces. And also the project went on to have many subsequent iterations, some of which are listed here in the slide, which created a kind of ongoing legacy of the original project, which is quite an interesting thing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bo, for outstanding presentation. We spoke about that, and we agreed that we will do something similar in the future. if we can. I hope that we can. And I hope that our participants have some questions to ask you later in discussion regarding Portavilions. It would be great to hear their opinion on this issue. I mean, Portavilions as kind of artwork and architecture feature as well. Thank you so much. Sada bih, you may end your share if you.
There you go.
Thank you. Sada bih pozvala gospođicu dr. Ivu Čukić da nam predstavi svoje izlaganje. Iva, izvolite.
Hvala, Jelena. Prvo, stvarno hvala Bo on extraordinary presentation, like super inspiring presentation. Ja ću na srpskom predstavljati danas zato što sam dosta dugo putovala i jako sam umorna i bojim se samo da će mi onda izaći iz glave šta treba. Takođe, htjela bih prvo se zahvalim na pozivu da učestvujem na ovom panelu. Oslonit ću se dosta na ono što je Jelena dotakla u uvodu, a tiče se oblikovanja javnih prostora, odnosa prema životnoj sredini, prema zajednici, prema gradu. Kod Bo mi se jako dopalo, u stvari, to mi sad odmah sam zapisala, kad je citirala Foucaulta, pa je onda pričala u kontekstu promišljanja grada i naših novih potreba kao društva i kako mi sad stvaramo u nekom neoliberalnom kapitalističkom kontekstu, što mislim da je izuzetno važno i da u stvari ta uloga arhitekte kao političke figure nedostaje u našem kontekstu još uvek. Ili se možda nazire, ali ne vrlo jasno. Ja bih počela od toga na koji način se mi bavimo praksom kao kolektiv i ja konkretno. Dakle, ja dolazim iz organizacije koja se zove Ministarstvo prostora i koja je nastala pre 11 godina, baš sa idejom da u stvari promišlja nove načine funkcionisanja grada i većeg angažmana ljudi u oblikovanju tog grada. Naš je fokus u urbanističkom planiranju, u stanovanju i u raspolaganju resursima koji su u javnoj svojini. Zašto mi je dodatno bila zanimljiva prezentacija koju Bo sada iznela, jeste zato što sam ja u doktoratu radila baš te kao privremene intervencije u javnom prostoru koje nastaju angažovanjem lokalne zajednice i nekih neformalnih grupa, a koje prave ovo što ona nazvala political shift ili neku političku promenu koja je u stvari suštinska kada razmišljamo o prostoru. Mi smo u našem radu u stvari dosta fokusirani na rad sa građanima i sa lokalnim inicijativama koje pokušavaju da se odbrane od neke vrste investitorskog urbanizma, kako se to popularno zove. U Beogradu, nažalost, svedočimo tome baš dosta i naše iskustvo u poslednjih nekoliko godina je da radimo sa od prilike 20 do 40 grupa godišnje komšijskih inicijativa, koje naravno uvek kreću od toga da zaštite zelenu površinu u svom kraju, drvo, šta god je u pitanju, a onda za mene najlepši trenutak je kada one postanu proaktivne, odnosno kada se desi ta vrsta sinergije među ljudima, da onda odluče da učestvuju u tome da njihov kvalitet života bude mnogo bolji. I naravno ne dešava se to svima, ali kad se desi ta promena, mi u stvari imamo političkog aktera, imamo nekoga ko posjeduje moć u tom procesu odlučivanja. Nametne se kao akter zapravo. Mi smo kroz naše iskustvo nekako primetili da u stvari ljudi imaju ideje, žele da se pitaju i samo im prosto niko nije dao priliku. I to je ono što pravi razliku. Dakle, naš urbanizam sada obeležava jedna vrsta deregulacije i strašnog napada na urbano tkivo, bez razmišljanja. Mislim da se ti to, Jelena, isto pomenula na početku, kako izgleda taj grad budućnosti, kome ga mi ostavljamo, šta tačno on treba da bude. A ako nije za nas, za koga je onda? Jedva čekam inače da čujem i Jelenino izlaganje za Zlatibor, pošto sam imala priliku da posle 15 godina odem na Zlatibor prošlo leto i ja nisam uopšte znala na kom mestu se nalazim. To je sada, nažalost, naša realnost. Čini mi se da je pitanje urbanističkog i prostornog planiranja postalo nekako politička tema u smislu toga da su ljudi osvestili da se to nas tiče i da moramo da reagujemo. Mi smo radili nedavno istraživanje javnog mnjenja na reprezentativnom uzorku građana Beograda, gde smo u stvari želeli da mapiramo šta su osnovni problemi i prioriteti u razvoju grada u kontekstu ovog novog generalnog urbanističkog plana Beograda koji će valjda uskoro biti na javnom uvidu. Ispostavilo se da ljudi imaju izuzetno progresivne ideje kako grad treba da se razvije, u kom pravcu, da su ključni problemi i prioriteti koji su bili mapirani su na prvom mestu saobraćaj. Skoro 80% građana Beograda smatra da je saobraćaj ozbiljan problem, ergo i prioritet za razvoj, a 50% smatra da je to životna sredina, što je u stvari jedan izuzetno važan, kako bih rekla, podatak i informacija da su ljudi osvestili da u stvari mi moramo da se bavimo našim prirodnim okruženjem i da moramo da to direktno utiče na naše zdravlje. Istovremeno je kolega sa Fakulteta arhitektonskog Nenad Simić objavio jedan izuzetno važan tekst koji se bavi investitorskim urbanizmom, a radio je poređenje izgradnje u novobeogradskim blokovima od perioda od 72. godine do 2022. odnosno odnos izgrađenog tkiva i zelenila. I evo sad, ja sam sebi zapisala te podatke, dakle 72. godine procenat zelenila u jednom prosečnom novom beogradskom bloku je bio 71%. 2022. on je 8%. A mi sad već prema planu generalne regulacije zelenih površina i drugim dokumentima znamo da trenutna količina zelenila, na primjer u Beogradu, je dovoljna za 300.000 ljudi. Da je procenat zelenila po glavi stanovnika ispod svakog evropskog proseka. A planovi i ono što se dešava zapravo uzurpira i javni prostor i zelenilo i ostavlja užasno mali prostor za neko unapređenje kvaliteta života ljudi koji u nekim naseljima žive. Osvrnut ću se sada i na 44. salon arhitekture koji je u direktnoj vezi sa ovim što sam pričala. Dakle, ja sam sada prvi put bila u žiriju salona arhitekture i to između ostalog zbog toga što je tema salona bila zaokret, odnosno što je on u nekom smislu bio u liniji sa mojim vrednostima i principima koje zastupam pri projektovanju i planiranju. A on je podrazumevao da mi u stvari kao arhitekte i urbanisti imamo odgovornost prema okruženju, imamo odgovornost prema građanima i moramo da smo mi u takvoj, kao što je Boj rekla, u jednom neoliberalnom vrtlogu, moramo da napravimo zaokret ka drugačijem društvu i drugačijem gradu, inače nam je sudnji dan dosta blizu. Tu je bio postavljen niz nekih pitanja na koje je trebalo odgovoriti, kako se odnosimo prema energetskoj tranziciji, prema životnoj sredini, prema kontekstu generalno. I ono što je nama kao žiriju bilo možda najznačajnije je deregulacija kao termin. Dakle, da u stvari su arhitekte toliko pritisnute potrebama, odnosno željama investitora, pa samim tim institucijama koje te želje pretvaraju u parametre, da užasno malo prostora ostaje i za neku ličnu kreativnost i lični pečat, ono Jelena o čemu sam pričala na početku, dakle koliko je našeg individualnog i autorskog u svemu tome. A s druge strane, ja se izvinjavam, mislim da je profesor Kadijević, da možda bi trebalo da se mutuje.
Da, izvinite.
Ništa. A sa druge strane je bila otvorena kategorija koja se bavila eksperimentom u arhitekturi i nekim virtualnim arhitektonskim prikazima. I tako, te su kategorije prvi put uvedene i strašno je bilo interesantno vidjeti koliko je u stvari, kada ne postoje te granice stvarnog života u kome mi trenutno živimo, nažalost u Srbiji, koliko postoji prostora za intervenisanje, koliko postoji prostora za neku vrstu promišljanja grada koji je u liniji vrednosti o kojima smo pričali danas. I ja se nadam da je taj salon u nekom smislu bar ostao upamćen kao jedna vrsta opomene i stvarnog zaokreta, šta je ono što mora da se napravi u praksi. jer ovo kuda sada idemo nikako nije dobro. Dakle, izgradnja K distrikta neposredno pored Kalemegdanske tvrđave je nešto što bi trebalo osuditi javno. I prosto to je odgovornost i autora tog objekta, ali i onih koji su to omogućili. Izgradnja u Košutnjaku, izgradnja na Makišu, dakle svi ti pojedinačni kompleksi su zapravo jedna vrsta uzurpacije prostora, ali i uzurpacije naših života. I naravno, nijedan od tih predloga, ideja nije bio ni prikazan na salonu. Mi smo se trudili u stvari da damo presek nečega iza čega možemo da stanemo kao žiri. Ono što je dodatno bilo zanimljivo je kategorije studentskih radova, koji su mi karakterisali kao neku vrstu eskapizma u nastavi. Dakle, da se sa mladim ljudima ne radi na način da se oni politizuju, odnosno da oni razumeju prostor i arhitekturu i urbanizam kao jednu vrstu političke teme, jer ona stvarno jeste, već je jako veliki broj radova se bavio, na primjer, projektovanjem na drugim planetama. Ja mogu da shvatim izazov toga i to je verovatno zanimljivo u smislu nekog izbornog predmeta, ali na masteru vi posle toga ulazite u stvarni život, a taj stvarni život nosi ozbiljne probleme i nekako je, ajde u najmanju ruku, nekorektno da to bude završni rad. I na kraju, evo samo još par stvari, pošto imam iskustvo rada i na drugim univerzitetima preko, imam utisak da je van naše zemlje ipak dozvoljena neka vrsta međusektorske, ne dozvoljena, nego poželjna neka vrsta međusektorske saradnje, na što se Boji i osvrnula pre toga, rekla je kao kako arhitekte misle da su bogovi. I mi smo tako školovani. Ja sam mislila da sam boginja arhitekture i sad ja kad diplomiram, ne da sam Zaha Hadid, nego Zaha Hadid je prašina za mene. A u stvari, kad dođete u realan svet, to ne funkcioniše tako. I vaše znanje se grade na osnovu interakcije sa drugim disciplinama i naukama i tako se dobije jedan prostor koji je prilagođen različitim potrebama i različitim ljudima. I onaj prostor u kome mi živimo sada i ovde i imamo odgovornost da ga ostavimo za sve buduće generacije koje dolaze nakon nas. Evo, ja bih ovde sad završila, nadam se da nisam bila preduga, trudila sam se da budem u nekom vremenu koje smo dogovorili, ali se u stvari radujem diskusiji posle.
Hvala vam, draga Iva. Samo smo, ajde da kažem, načeli neke teme o kojima ćemo naknadno razgovarati u diskusiji. Vrlo inspirativno i vrlo zanimljivo i nešto o čemu Boja često razgovaramo i nešto što i planiramo da radimo. Ja ću biti dovoljno slobodna da celu ovu vašu prezentaciju i ostale prezentacije prevedemo na engleski, da ona može da ima apsolutni uvid u sve ovo o čemu smo razgovarali.
Ja sam i naslutila inače da smo na istoj liniji po vašim uvodima i Bojnoj prezentaciji, da je to tačno kako se dobro naslanja.
Inače, moram samo još jednu stavku da kažem, Bo se neće naljutiti, ona je inače udata za arhitektu. Te tako, mislim da je to prosto logična stvar. Ovom prilikom bih takođe htela da pozdravim mog uvaženog profesora Aleksandra Kadijevića koji je večeras sa nama. Izuzetna mi je čast i zadovoljstvo, profesore, što ste ovde. Iskreno se radujem diskusiji nakon naših panelista. Sada bih pozvala da svoje izlaganje kaže profesor dr. Nenad Perić. On će govoriti o jednoj izuzetnoj izložbi, a to je Beograd, putovanje kroz vreme. Profesor, izvolite.
Evo, za početak da se zahvalim i Jeleni i svim učesnicima na prisustvovanju. Eto, dođu smo i do ovog četvrtog okupljanja ŠumArta. Uskoro će se vidjeti prvo jubilarno proslaviti, osnovno rečeno. Drago mi da svaki put vidim neka nova lica i pozdravljam dosadašnje govornike, govornice, da koristim rodnu ravnopravnost. Bilo su vrlo zanimljiva izlaganja. Moje izlaganje će biti povezano sa arhitekturom na generalnom nivou, obzirom da arhitekta nisam, imao sam tu čast, tako mogu da kažem, slušam arhitekturu jednu godinu na fakultetu, ali opet i na osnovu nekih ličnih interesovanja koje sam kao, da kažemo, producent pretočio u izložbu koja je Jelena pomenuli, koji će se održati u Galeriji nauke i tehnike SANU krajem avgusta i tokom prve polovine septembra, a pod istim nazivom kao predavanja, to je Beograd putovanje kroz vreme, odnosno Belgrade Journal of Time. I to neko moje lično interesovanje kao i ljubav prema rodnom gradu i, da kažemo, poređenje sa arhitekturom i nekim generalnim istorijskim razvojom sa poređenju sa još nekolicinom gradova na istoku i na zapadu u kojima sam živeo. Tako da počet ću od toga da Beograd uslovno počiva između ostaloga i na najstarije stalno naseljenom području u Evropi, ono koje je bilo centar vinčarske kulture, koja se širila uz reke Savu i Dunav prevashodno. I da je kao takvo, ne čudi nas da je Beograd jedan od najstarijih evropskih gradova. Ovo područje je uvijek bilo raskršće puteva, a naravno na raskršću puteva po već ustaljenoj praksi se prelamaju interesi, pa je tako Beograd, na primjer, imao sudbinu kao retko koji grad, makar ja ne znam ni za jednu prestonicu evropsku, možda je to i šire, ali na njegovom području, na primjer, vođeno 45 bitaka, Beograd je rušen nekolicinu puta, apsolutno, 2 ili 3 puta je izgoreo i poslednje razaranje se desilo pre manje od 4 veka i još uvijek imamo te značajne zgrade koje svedoče tom razaranju, to je zgrada starog generalštaba Nikole Dobrovića, jednog od svakako naših najznačajnijih arhitekata, kao i zgrada komande avijacije Dragiše Brašovna, isto jednog od vodećih slovenskih arhitekata. Obe zgrade su naravno zaštićene kao spomenici kulture, ova druga je rađena sa skulpturama Ive Meštrovića, najznačajnijih vajara je skulptura s ovog područja, koji je takođe bio arhitekta. Ali, zbog svega navedenog, znači to što smo sagradili kuću na raskrsnici puteva, a doduše i nekog našeg nemara, to moramo priznati, mi smo baš možda najorganizovaniji narod, nažalost. Beograd nije možda primer nekog preterano lepog grada. Ima mnogo tu neusklađenih stilova, različitih tipova gradnji, mnogo ima nelogičnih nekih rešenja ili stvari koje su bile isplanirane da se urede pa se nisu uradile, a Beograd je nastavio naravno se razvija određenim tokom, pa se to predstavlja i problem kako za grad, tako i njegove građane. Ali je kao takav ipak Beograd svedok vremena i moram ovo reći, kroz neku lični neki patos, on je veoma bogat svojim duhom, a taj duh u stvari čini grad, jer možete da imate najlepše građevine, najbolju arhitekturu u svakom smislu te reči, ali ako taj grad nema duh, to je kao, ajde da kažemo, neki odnos u arhitekturi. Arhitekture kod nas se vodi kao tehnički fakultet u većini zemalja, pretpostavljam to će koleginica Iva potvrditi, ali možete da napravite u arhitektonskom smislu savršenu zgradu koja će izdržati 9,5 stepeni zemljotresa po Richterovoj skali, ali ako ta zgrada nije lepa, onda ona, da kažemo, druži svoju okolinu i taj grad u kojem je, a s druge strane, ako imate najlepšu zgradu koja u stvari tehnički nije funkcionalna i u kojoj ljudi neće moći da uživaju, mislim, da kažemo, da žive u njoj ili rade, ili je posećaju, ako je to neka javna ustanova, onda opet ništa niste uradili. I u tom smislu, na osnovu književnosti, kinematografije, slikarstva, muzike, naravno, arhitekture, vizualnih umetnosti i uopšte stručne literature koje se bavi prostornim i urbanim planiranjem, kao i mnogobrojnim putovanjima po različitim zemljama različitim kontinentima i života na istoku i zapadu. Mogu reći da sam, makar što se tiče Evrope, sreo samo još jedan grad koji bi se mogao, koji ima izuzetno izražen kosmopolitski duh, koji je manji po broju stanovnika, koji je manji od 2 miliona. I mišljen sam da nam taj kosmopolitski duh nekom gradu svakako daju i građevine, bez obzira na ova spomenuta razaranja, neusklađenosti, sve što nam se dešavalo i povodom ovog drugog moram priznati da me duboko pogađa napad, kako bi to definisao, građevinske industrije profiterskog profila, ali bez obzira na sve to, ja znam da će Beograd izdržati, jer njegov duh kao grada i njegovih građana, Beograđana, ipak ima tog Feniksa u sebi. I pohvaljujem ovo što Iva radi u Ministarstvu prostora, to je jedna super akcija, jer taj napad koji se trenutno vrši na Beogradu, to je sveopšte jagme za parama, neće uništiti Beograd, ali će ga naružiti. Kao jedan od najstarijih gradova, ipak predstavnica naše zemlje, kakva je, takva je, da li je velika ili mala, to nije bitno. Taj jedan kosmopolitski grad zaslužuje dovoljno ljudi koji će se dovoljno boriti za isti, jer ima jedna stara izreka kojom će završiti ovo izlaganje, koje se greškom prepisuje Woodrow Wilsonu, američkom predsjedniku, u stvari je rekao jedan niski narodni vođa iz perioda srednjeg veka, to je da je sve što je potrebno da zlo nadvlada na ovome svetu jeste da svi dobri ljudi sede skrštenih ruku i ništa ne čine. Eto, drago mi je što vidim da i dalje ima ljudi koji ne mogu da sede skrštenih ruku i da ne deluju kada im nešto zasmeta i kada postoji neka nelogičnost ili nešto loše što se dešava oko njih, konkretno u ovom gradu, i pružim im svu moralnu podršku, a u profesionalnom smislu i stojim na usluzi kao producent za bilo koje aktivnosti u tom smeru. Moje predavanje je trebalo oko 7 minuta. Počeli smo 7:07, pa eto tako završavam u tom numeralističkom stilu. Zahvaljujem se na slušanju i zahvaljujem se Jeleni na najavi, tako da možemo da pređemo na sledeći govornik.
Pre svega ja bih se vama zahvalila, ocenjeni profesore, a i još jednom, ako nije problem, da kažemo kada je izložba, multimedijalna izložba putovanja.
Nismo još tačno definisali multimedijalna izložba, nismo definisali datum započinje, znači bit će poslednje nedelje avgusta i završit će se 14. Znači poslednje nedelje, to će biti neki 23. 4. avgust. Svakako ću obavestiti, onako, mislim, samo na kraju krajeva i samo obaveštava javnost. Još nešto polemišemo oko dana, da li će da bude radni dan ili vikend, i možda nešto stavimo sa telefon, bilo kako bilo u ovom sportnom programu. Tako da sve koleginice i kolege koje učestvuju u ovom forumu i koje su učestvuju u prethodnim forumima će biti obavešteni, a zahvaljujem se na interesovanju i podršci do sadašnje.
Uvek, profesore. Hvala vam puno, a sada bih zamolila mladu koleginicu, doktoranta Jelenu Gačić-Ivanov, da predstavi svoju temu, a to je arhitektura Zlatibora, od zamisli arhitekte Jovanke Jeftanović do masovne urbanizacije. Izvolite, Jelena.
Samo ovde mi piše host disabled participant screen sharing, tako da...
To je ono što je bilo i sa Bo isto, sada ćemo...
I think I'm still the host, yeah, because I've been letting people into the call, but it's fine.
Yeah, I will make her host as well. Never mind.
You can switch it to her, to Jelena.
Okay. Let me see. tehnika. Jel može sada, Jelena?
Može, evo.
Sjajno.
Da li vidite?
Da.
Samo da vidim. Da probam. Da li vidite menjanje slajdova? Samo to da proverim. Dobroveče, poštovana publiko. Ja sam doktorant Jelena Gačić-Ivanov i današnje predavanje će biti, dakle, o arhitekturi Zlatiboru, usklađeno, sa temom ove konferencije, zato što ono što se dešava trenutno na Zlatiboru je prosto, da kažem, situacija koja sve više zaokuplja pažnju kako stručne, tako i šire javnosti. Tako da ću se osvrnuti prosto na arhitektonski razvoj, dakle, Zlatibora od samih početaka sa posebnim osvrtom na delatnost arhitekte Jovanke Jeftanović. Dakle, naime, Zlatibor, dakle, planina, vazdušna banja, bogata, dakle, svojim prirodnim bogatstvima još od međuratnog perioda, dakle, bila veoma primamljiva za ljude širom Srbije, tako da je prosto građanska klasa iz Beograda već tada, dakle, 30. godina prošlog veka počela da gradi svoje, da tako kažem, vikendice, odnosno letnikovce na Zlatiboru. Međutim, prvi urbanistički poduhvati da se Zlatibor prosto urbanistički, arhitektonski afirmiše jesu upravo poduzeti nakon Drugog svetskog rata, znači 1955. godine, kada je tadašnja vlast angažovala arhitektu Jovanku Jeftanović, koja je bila zaposlena u projekt birovu, sarađivala, dakle, sa Mihajlom Mitrovićem i Radivojem Tomićem, i doktora Dragoslava Zeka Smiljanića, koji je bio stručnjak iz oblasti klimatologije Zlatibora, da dođu da prosto podnesu svoja stručna mišljenja kako bi Zlatibor trebao dalje da se razvija. I tada je, dakle, arhitekta Jovanka Jeftanović prosto smatrala da postoje određena naselja koje bi trebalo prosto naseljavati, graditi. To su bile, dakle, to su bili Palisad, Partizanske vode i mnoga druga. Smatrala je da centar prosto treba da bude strogo kontrolisan to nekom niskom gradnjom spratnosti maksimalno 4 sprata, da zdravstvene ustanove gde su se lečili plućni bolesnici trebaju biti separatisani od vikendica, od dečjih odmarališta i ostalih turističkih objekata. Takođe smatrala, dakle, da ona mora stalno kontrolisati kako se zapravo Zlatibor gradi, da nijedan projekat prosto ne može bez njene dozvole da se realizuje. Što se tiče, dakle, privatnih vikendica, ona je razmatrala isključivo projekte koji su bili prilagođeni tom prirodnom okruženju. To su pre svega bile kuće alpskog, nordijskog, tirolskog i zlatiborskog tipa. Tako da je ona prosto i svoje projekte, glavne projekte na Zlatiboru saglašavala prosto sa tom okolnom arhitekturom. Prvi projekat jeste ovaj hotel Idependance Palisad, koji je u ovim etapama građen. Kao što možete vidjeti, dakle, to je arhitektura koja je prosto uklopljena sa prirodnim ambijentom, korišćeni su materijali iz obližnjih fabrika i majdana, dakle, prirodni domaći materijali kao što su, recimo, drvo, kamen, opeka. Takođe dosta posvećivala pažnju interijeru, prosto da eksterijer i interijer budu koherentno usaglašeni. Zatim je projektovala lovački dom u naselju Vodice. Takođe, dakle, smatrali da naselje Vodice može urbanistički, arhitektonski da se razvija, ali opet strogo kontrolisano, da ona prosto stalno ima uvid kako će se sve to regulisati. Dakle, sarađivala je tesno sa tadašnjim opštinskim vlastima. Zatim je projektovala i spomenik na Partizanskim vodama u saradnji sa čuvenom vajarkom Anom Bešlić, prosto da memorizuje žrtve koje su stradale prilikom evakuacije Užičke bolnice. Međutim, sve se, dakle, menja kada ona zapravo odlazi sa Zlatibora negde 60. godina, pošto je penzionisana 1968. godine. I ono što je ona zapravo zahtevala od vlasti da kontrolišu tu gradnju, urbanizam Zlatibora, je kontrolisano do nekih 80. godina 20. veka, međutim svi znamo što se dešavalo 90-ih, slom i raspad Jugoslavije, prosto ekonomska kriza, sve se više i više napuštaju načela koje je arhitekta Jovanka Jevtanović prosto zagovarala, da se Zlatibor kontrolisano gradi, da se ne narušavaju, dakle, da se ne narušava taj njegov prirodni ambijent. Međutim, u poslednje vreme je to dosta, da tako kažem, uzelo maha, tako da smo danas svedoci te masovne urbanizacije, masovne arhitektonske produkcije. Dakle, ovde možemo videti takozvanu Titovu vilu koja je sada okružena ovom novogradnjom, inače se nalaze u parkovskom okruženju. Recimo, Jovanka Jevtanović je separatisala te međuratne vile od ostatka posleratne gradnje, međutim, to se u poslednjih par godina potpuno napustilo, tako da evo šta se danas dešava. Dešava se ta masovna urbanizacija koja se prosto podvodi po taj kapital. Kažu da je, to jest dosta sam čitala o tome da je tržište dosta aktivno, da ljudi kupuju nekretnine na Zlatiboru koje zaista se sve više i više usložnjavaju. Arhitektura nije uklopljena sa ambijentom onako kako je Jovanka Jevtanović kada je stupila na svoju dužnost projektovala i materijalizovala na svojim objektima. Dakle, ovo je jedna nekontekstualna arhitektura koja se pre svega rukovodi tim profitom i prosto zadovoljenjem tržišta. Tako da za ovo 10-minutno izlaganje ću konstatovati da su se zamisli arhitekta Jovanke Jevtanović u potpunosti napustile. Ona je pre nekoliko godina dobila ulicu na Zlatiboru, hteli su da je odaju počast time, međutim i nisu uspeli zato što su zaista u potpunosti napustili sve ono za što se ona zalagala, za što se borila. I kada je videla da sve to zapravo uzima maha i da se njene zamisli neće realizovati, ona je zapravo napustila svoj poziv, tako da vidjet ćemo šta će na kraju od svega ovoga da ispadne, ali eto, htela sam prosto da ukažem koliko je sve to sada, nažalost, drugačije od onoga što ona zamislila. Tako da hvala na pažnji. Držala sam se svog 10-minutnog izlaganja, tako da zahvaljujem na pozivu.
Hvala puno, Jelena. Mislim da o ovome možemo razgovarati i u okviru diskusije, te tako sada pozivam moje drage koleginice Natašu Tapić i Smiljku Čabraju da preuzmu palicu i da vode diskusiju. Izvolite.
Thank you, Jelena. Because Smiljka introduced our meeting, I will try to conclude because I'm very much inspired by the presentations. And I'm speaking English right now because, of course, I'd like to start with Bo because I'm very much amazed by what I heard. And you inserted the bug in my head. I can't stop thinking about curating an exhibition in public and open green space, the whole 8% that we have left. But unfortunately, that is the case, as we saw in Zlatibor, in Belgrade, and all over Serbia. But we saw a glimpse of London, and my biggest impression is that all the participants followed like the same line of thought, because we all underlined, I mean, you all underlined the importance of people and communities living and existing in urban spaces and development, but also that we all have that historical view that we inherited architecture and now we are making some for future generations, and who are we making it for, and what people will study about us. So I will go maybe backwards and start with Jelena. We will be informal because we know each other from university, that both her and Diva spoke about some form of activism, because she's trying from academic point of view to underline the importance of studying the new architecture and to criticize and to put that in a spotlight. But also Eva said that she said all about the pressures that architects and architectural bureaus are under and how much the politics are involved. But She spoke about Belgrade, and my opinion is that in Belgrade, people are very much activistic about preserving green spaces and public health and traffic, because we all see that as an issue, and I think we are influencing the architecture. We are trying to do that, but as we saw on Zlatibor, the case is different. People are buying flats and buildings that do not belong to the urban area. So I think that the experts need to react in a different way. So thank you, Jelena, for your work, basically. And Professor Perić talked also about, as Bo, about the nature of architecture, because we as art historians are sometimes putting more emphasis on forms, but it also needs to be functional, because if we put emphasis on one or the other, then it all loses the point. And my first official question is to Dr. Čukić, because personally I went to some lectures about sustainability, and people are taking two approaches. Some are choosing material to be more sustainable in two different ways also, going back to 19th century ways of building and using those materials, but also, as we mentioned, Zaha Hadid taking the most modern approach to preserve everything from humidity and temperature to making everything sustainable, and using architecture to be in synergy with nature. But also my opinion is that a lot of personal choices when it comes to building homes are to use those use those two techniques, but also to make the whole urbanistic area more sustainable. But so I wanted to ask your view on that. Is that maybe, because I saw examples all over Europe for that, but not in Serbia, is that something that is researched or trying to make possible or something like that? Because those are the two public areas that can be basically done for doing that in the city center, but also making smaller communities that are sustainable and green, as we said.
Thank you, Nat, for your question. First, I also want to thank Jelena and Nenad for their presentation, but Jelena especially, since she really kind of sparkled new ideas in my head, and also the issue of accountability of the architects in these processes. So, for example, there were projects sent by architects to this Salon of Architecture, where they were building on Divčibare, which is a similar context as Zlatibor, and they were putting in the rooftop. So the building is like the ground floor and then the rooftop. They were putting in the rooftop 4 additional floors, with the explanation that the investor requested the maximum amount of construction. So this is like literally getting involved into devastation of the natural resources and not being accountable for the things that you are involved in. And I think it's really, really terrible situation, especially since we are all appreciating these natural surroundings because they're wonderful as they are. So by any kind of intervention in those spaces, we are destroying the environments where we are going to be. Also linked to that, it's this real estate market around the property buying. The research shows that it's related exclusively to making investments. So it's not about figuring out your housing problem or whatever. It's just to have additional value on the market. And it's a global problem, not only in Serbia, but in terms of, for example, housing in Serbia, 70% of people are falling under the category of supported housing, 70%. That's a huge majority of people. And there is no national or local strategies on how this burning crisis can be solved. In terms of what you asked me about the climate change and just energy transition and like environmental issues. So these things are recognized in our laws and plans, but they are not legally binding parameters. That's the problem. So for example, you have in the plan for in the regulation plan for green areas in Belgrade, you have one parameter that says every time you build a public space like squares or whatever, you have to include 30% of the green spaces that are in the direct touch with the floor. That never happens. Look at the main square in Belgrade that was like recently open. And then on top of it, you are not using the natural materials or any, let's say natural materials, but you're using concrete, iron, and glass. And they are all transmitting the heat that is happening. So Professor Vladimir Đurđević, you are all well known about him from the Faculty of Physics. He did the research on how much the level of temperature increase in these spaces yearly. And it goes really high because we are not thinking about the materials that we use. So the regulation is there, but unfortunately the laws in regulation in Serbia are very flexible, and it really depends on the power of the investor if they are going to respect it or not.
Eva, may I ask you something? When you say 70%, are you talking about social housing? Are you talking about people who are housing insecure? Are you talking about 70% who are in a different category than that? Is that what you meant, or did you mean something else?
It's fall under the category of supported housing in terms that people are putting more than 40% of their income into the housing issues, maintaining rents, whatever. And it caused the housing stress, which is on the level of 30%. And there was also an additional data given by the Republic Data Institution a few months ago that only 5% of people are buying flats in Belgrade. Out of these 5%, 86 is in cash. So they already have that money. So it directly shows that they are like investing and building new value and not solving their housing, like the roof above their heads.
It's counter then. They're not actually housing insecure. They're doing this as an additional income.
Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your answer. We could, explore the subject even more, but that's what I wanted to ask, because I think at the end of the day, you can get all the laws you want. I think it's about personal choice, what you support and do not support. And
but it's not just like that. So for example, we are now in the collective thinking a lot about this. So we have to, the climate change is our reality. That's it. We need to adopt some mechanisms and have a response on it. But it's really tricky how it's going to influence the social issues and affordability of housing at the same time. So we can say that in a long-term period, it makes the housing or whatever else affordable. But like the first input, it's not. And people are sensitive to that. That's why when we are discussing in our local context about the climate justice, it's discussed as an elite, as a snobbish thing, because we have real problems. And that's also real, but in our context, it's not recognized still.
Yes, of course. That's why I ask about those communities that are building outside and are building with regulations and with laws, because I saw an architectural bureau in Germany. They are building like that, but they're strictly looking to minimize the costs of building and also for heating, for gas and stuff like that. So there are also two currents to that, but it is a very complex subject. And I also wanted to ask you personally, how are architectural bureaus dealing with that collective thinking? Because as Jelena said in the beginning, in the introduction, those are issues that need to be fought, and we covered a lot of those, but it is a group of people working together. So is it possible to influence a group that way, or is it the investors, or how are the groups functioning in that?
Yeah, I would say that there is a mistake made in the first step at the Faculty of Architecture. Architects are trained to feel and to act as individuals, not as a collective body. And it's very male-oriented profession. So, for example, you have mostly women in urban planning because that is a collective action. And it's less famous than being architectural designer, which is kind of for men more challenging and more inspiring and more like their target thing. So I would say what is also needed besides of like putting that into agenda on the very first step, like first day of architectural school, to introduce interdisciplinarity and collective work and like the real life around you. The next thing is the strong association of architects that will stand behind you. So if we are all like break into small groups, we cannot be a power actor in this decision making in how we are organizing our surrounding, which is now happening. Because it's our profession is put on the very bottom, and from very bottom individuals are reacting because they're struggling to survive, and there you don't have collectiveness, you don't have empowerment, you don't have this kind of solidarity that is needed to change the perspective.
Thank you. Maybe I should ask Jelena, Mrs. Ivanov. Sorry, there are two Jelenas. I'm confusing. Eva mentioned that about Zlatibor. You can perhaps answer the question. How do you feel about what's going on Zlatibor in terms of what she said about collective thinking, and how is that influencing architecture there?
Mogu ja samo na srpskom ako nije problem. U poslednje vreme dosta pratim situaciju na tržištu, pogotovo sad što se dešava u poslednje vreme, tako da ono što se dešava na Zlatiboru je maltene simultano prati ono što se dešava u Beogradu, gde stvarno dosta ljudi kupuje nekretnine tamo za gotov keš novac, čak ne za kredite, smatraju da je to veoma dobra investicija, da pogotovo ova krizna vremena prosto vredi uložiti u nekretnine. Tako da prosto ta velika potražnja na tržištu prosto diktira to što se dešava, jer prosto ne bi oni sve to radili da se ne kupuje. Znači to je jedna realna potreba. I paradoksalno, dosta sam čitala iskustva ljudi na forumu i ljudi kažu kupit ću na Zlatiboru, tamo je zelenilo, čist vazduh. Pa možda je bilo tako pre par godina, ali sad definitivno više nije to slučaj. Tako da prosto tržište diktira i onda, eto, angažuju arhitekte, oni prosto moraju, mislim ne moraju, nego za svoju egzistenciju to rade i onda sve to uzročno-posledična veza. Ali definitivno da nema potražnje ne bi bilo ni ponude. Eto, prosto jednostavno.
Da, zbog toga sam i postavila pitanje, jer nekako povezani smo na taj način.
Ako mogu samo jedno pitanje Jeleni da postavim, iz vašeg iskustva, da li je slična situacija, na primjer, na Kopaoniku ili ne? Evo, pošto smo nas dve Kruševljanke, pa ću pitati i za Jastrebac, konkretno, kakva je situacija na Jastrebcu gore? Da li imate bilo kakvo saznanje šta se gore radi?
Pa za Jastrebac ne, ali baš kad sam radila master vezano za posleratnu arhitekturu u Kruševcu, pričala sam i sa arhitektama i sa, da kažem, običnim građanstvom i nisam dobila informaciju da se recimo na Jastrebcu isto to radi, nego da je baš Zlatibor taj koji je na prvom mestu, pa neka na drugom bude Kopaonik. Znači tu su negde, da tako kažem, a Jastrebac ne toliko, tek on treba da se... Da.
Treće, da. A kakva je situacija, evo sad, mislim, kad već pričamo o vašoj temi koju ste radili u Kruševcu, kakva je situacija što se tiče urbanizma i urbanističkog plana u Kruševcu, da li imate neke, ne mislim samo Kruševac konkretno, nego uopšte da li imate za neka manja mesta, odnosno ako govorimo uopšte o urbanističkim problemima, a imamo ih, Beograd je samo nešto što je paradigma onoga što se dešava trenutno u našoj zemlji, ali mislim da da kažem, manja mesta trpe mnogo veći udar što se tiče neplanske gradnje i tome slično. Pa ako biste mogli nešto o tome da kažete.
Pa naravno da u Kruševcu nije situacija kao u Beogradu, međutim oni nekim sitnim koracima slede Beograd i bilo je dosta nekih urbanističkih planova, recimo da se sagradi čitav kompleks stambenih zgrada kod aerodroma. Pa su tu isto se ljudi pobunili, grade se nove zgrade u centralnom gradskom jezgru, recimo srušena je fabrika Crvena zvezda da bi se sagradio novi stambeni kompleks investitora Arabike. I baš sam pričala sa ljudima i pitaju se ko kupuje te stanove. Kruševac je maltene mrtav grad, odatle ljudi odlaze, ne mogu da nađu posao za neke pristojne plate. Ti stanovi nisu ništa, da kažem, jeftiniji od onih u većim gradovima, a kupuje se, investitori kažu da su prodali maltene većinu stanova, da nisu ništa ni sagradili, tako da nekim sitnim koracima i Kruševac sledi ove, da kažem, veće gradove, tako da situacija nije baš pozitivna. To moram da kažem.
I'd just like to say, both in relation to Eva, but also Jelena Ivanov, I wish that I could understand absolutely every word that you're saying. Unfortunately, I can't get everything, so I'm probably missing a lot of really useful and interesting content. But something that I feel is sort of emerging out of what both of you are saying, and it actually is really nice, all of these talks kind of fit together so beautifully because of this, is that, you know, we're often thinking about the source of issues as being, you know, top down, the issue stemming from a top down situation. But actually what you're saying is that this is also coming from the bottom up, whereby essentially consumer behavior, if you like, you know, those who already have, who want to, you know, continue to sort of acquire more, if you like, are actually causing, you know, in a sense, contributing to these issues very directly. So in a sense, if there were no buyers of these flats in the middle of nature and so on, or in obscure places across Belgrade that or in the center, that in fact, you know, you question how many of these buildings would still be continuing to be built. And we're often not looking at it this way. I think we're often very much looking at it as these things are imposed on us against our will. But, you know, I hear this question being raised all the time in Belgrade, where people are saying, who's buying these? Who's buying these flats? Who's living there? They seem to be empty. Who's buying these flats? And that statistic that Eva mentioned of 70% is really, really telling. You know, so it's not essentially people who don't have enough space and are trying to essentially, you know, create some additional space by selling a previous apartment to buy something bigger for their family or what have you. It's actually subsequent, you know, apartments. So that's, you know, I think it's really, that ties in quite well, you know, indirectly with some of the work in that I mentioned, that I discussed today. In particular, you know, Monika Seznaska, who's a really, really interesting artist. She, you know, lived in Poland through this kind of transition from kind of communism into capitalist, more political sphere. And a lot of her work discusses that, but in a sense, you know, on the one hand, obviously some of her work is critical of what took place under communism, but then on the other side, she's actually suggesting with her work that what we see emerging now is really not much better. It's just in a different form. And so there's that tension going on as well, whereas, you know, people, you know, had houses, everyone had a flat, everyone had a place to live, and they were quite robust, stable environments with green spaces around them. Now they're just being plummeted. And, you know, a lot of the buildings that are being created in cities across Poland are actually, you know, the average citizen can't really afford to even buy them. So, you know, it's only the kind of upper echelons, if you like, of the society that are actually able to you know, buy these new flats. And in addition to that, they've actually, you know, gotten rid of some really you know, amazing works of architecture in the process. So there's that sort of this transition going on And it's not always very, very clear. So I think that's very, very important to recognize this notion that actually we're all participating, that we're all a part of this, as opposed to this is something that's happening to us. Because I think if we, not only do we lose power, when we sort of approach things from that position, we become the victim, but actually we can kind of empower ourselves by saying, actually, we do have a choice. What is this building? Are we going to boycott this? Are we going to, what have you? And I think, unfortunately, that is going to have to be really led by people who can afford, do have the possibility to do this, to really think about their kind of behavior and what the consequences of that are. So
I would really like to second that if it's all right with you. Yeah, I mean, we are turning to consumer society with all the imposed needs, even though they are not like the real needs of the people. Also, we had this period of socialism where like the life was created differently. It was stigmatized in the 90s because the nationalist government wanted to make it like that. So over the night, it turned from ours to mine. And now you have to break it without making the direct connections to the previous period, because it is a period of like trauma for some people, so on and on. So we need to change the narratives. However, we had the example of Belgrade on water, which is like the new identity of Belgrade and the progress of our country and so on, which is next to New Belgrade, which we visited with our students a week ago. And those are the most lively neighborhoods that exist in Belgrade, to be honest. They are the most green. They have schools and kindergartens and like the recreational spaces in between. People are living there. They are happy. There are studies that show that the most satisfied people in Belgrade are people who are living in New Belgrade blocks. Even though somebody who is looking from a side would say, oh, it's too much concrete for my taste. Okay, maybe in the facades, but it's also kind of a unique touch of the period of time when it was built. But like in total, it is the most human scale design that we ever had or will ever had. When you're walking through Belgrade waterfront, it's like you're walking through parallel universe, literally. It's like a cartoon scenography that is around you. You don't understand why it's there. Then in between the buildings, you can kind of see the glance of old Belgrade somewhere behind. The image is wrong. It's like glitching in your head. But what I mean, I'm aware that it's built and it won't be destroyed. But what I think, and we were directly involved in the struggle against Belgrade waterfront, is that it actually politicized the question of urban planning. And afterwards, people felt empowered to react. So now we have different community groups who are not allowing this kind of in jeopardizing of immediate environment, but they're like really like to protect it and to develop it according to their needs. And for me, if I'm analyzing the whole case with Belgrade waterfront, I would say, and I'm like super optimistic always, it's like, this is the huge success, or this is our win. Our achievement is in those limits, and it's already something.
Eva, thank you for second part of the speech, if I could say something like that. I would have to excuse myself, and thanks one more, Jelena, for everything, and I hope to meet you like maybe in September, right? So maybe we could announce the date if you already have the date. And once more, cheers, bye.
Hvala profesore Periću, hvala vam puno na učešću. Da li postoji još neko pitanje ili da možemo da zaključimo ovaj zvanični deo konferencije?
This is really interesting, Eva, what you're saying about Belgrade waterfront, because obviously, there's been so much kind of, I suppose it's such a polemical kind of issue, in my opinion, in Belgrade. There's so many people that hate it. A lot of architects also who strongly dislike it. And so this is a really interesting kind of flip sort of scenario that you're saying, like the people who are living there are actually really satisfied. They feel there are green spaces around. It's an active kind of area. two things strike me in this though. Firstly, for me, the scale of that is so unrespectful. I dare say, so unrespectful to the rest of Belgrade. So in a sense, yes, it's kind of like a novelty, but in a way, maybe I come from a more kind of classical tradition of European cities, if you like, but I actually really like when, the historical kind of architecture is protected against this kind of really violent, massive buildings right in the middle where they kind of dwarf the rest of the city, and of course beautiful architecture that's surrounding it. So this is sitting really in contrast with that. So that's the first thing that I would want to ask about that. But also the other thing, when you make the suggestion that that obviously the people who are living there are feeling very satisfied and they feel like they have their needs met. But again, aren't these like a very, very privileged percentage of the population of Belgrade? Because as far as I understand, to be able to acquire one of those flats, it puts you in a particular category. Let's just say, in terms of having the economic capability to actually acquire such a property. So when you say that, in a sense, isn't that then also kind of like an elitist, saying in a sense, like, of course, the rich in their gated communities are very, satisfied and feeling, with their swimming pools and so on, while those outside the gates are kind of in a different demographic. So yeah, go ahead.
No, I was actually, just to clarify, referring to New Belgrade comparing to Belgrade and Waterfront because they're next to each other. Yes, but now you remind me, we did a public poll opinion on Belgrade Waterfront as well, and people kind of are more pro for the project than against it, because the whole, and that's also a trick made by, I would say, architects mostly. There was a discussion, the initial discussion about the aesthetics of the project. So when the project was introduced as, like the new identity, the progress, economical, social, political, in every single sense, the project after the country was devastated for like 20 years, people really wanted to like take selfie in front of those shiny buildings. And all the renders were made like 4 members, happy family with golden retriever wandering around. This is the future that we all want to, like secure future. And then it's very difficult to discuss all the issues that are behind. What is actually behind the project? What is the politics? What is the economical consequences? What is the social? What is the ghettoization? And it will definitely, it brings it already, like the spatial and social segregation, it's visible. People cannot afford living there because the square meter in Belgrade Waterfront is between 3,500 euros up to 10,000 euros per meter.
I heard that also, yeah.
That is literally above every single average income that you can imagine in Serbia. So in this sense, it's already visible. The consequences are visible, but it's still in the narrative where we are kind of feeling good there. It's kind of clean, it's different.
That's also, and also there are businesses there now, Of course, I, from my own personal space, would have loved to see that a whole park, a green park.
I totally agree with you.
But I just want to say, Falabog, that you're saying that, that you're making the comparison between New Belgrade. I'm sorry, I must have missed that. A comparison between New Belgrade and Belgrade on Water. I understood something different. That makes a lot more sense. New Belgrade, it's a totally different story. Actually, yeah. I have lots of friends who live there and say they think it's the best place in Belgrade to live.
Exactly.
Big roads, it's very family orientated. You have loads of amenities, it's near to the river, you have cycle paths, lots of different green space all around. Absolutely, I would definitely support that assertion. I'm glad that you were not speaking about Belgrade.
No. Sorry. Maybe I'm like super tired. It's just like squeezing the word.
My heart sunk momentarily. No, I mean, I don't want to be overly critical either, you know. I mean, I think that, you know, we've seen these kinds of projects emerge all over Europe. I mean, in Paris, you know, they have the new part of the city and they have the old part of the city where they also separated, you know, this and did it relatively well, where they didn't kind of interfere with the center, if you like, and allowed, I mean, they also have a very specific kind of, in that city, a very specific kind of orientation in that regard. But there are a lot of cities, I mean, you know, I formerly lived and teach in Glasgow in Scotland. And we also have a really, I don't know if any of you are familiar with sort of that as a historical context in terms of architecture, but there's been huge transitions in the city as well. And, you know, Glasgow historically was an industrial city prior to the Thatcher generation. And, you know, it was a shipbuilding city. It's on the River Clyde. And a lot of people lived, you know, up until really like the 70s and 80s in really pretty dire circumstances, really poor conditions. And, you know, there was even still like a lot of like sickness and so on. And so, you know, some very city planners and architects thought, well, let's start building some high rises in order to kind of give the population, you know, a better, kind of some better living conditions than they're currently living in. But what that meant is actually basically just ripping out the 19th century tenements, you know, sandstone tenements that were very ornate and beautiful, built across the city, and also which are the kind of, if you like, primary aesthetic kind of emphasis or interesting feature, if you like, of Glasgow, which is like otherwise very industrial, kind of not very beautiful city outside of these beautiful sandstone tenements. And it gives the city, you know, a lot of character. Without them, I don't know what the city would not be what it is. And unfortunately, they just tore out whole blocks and said to the inhabitants, you know, we'll rehouse you, you'll have a free flat we'll give you a flat in the new high rise. But and subsequently also built a motorway that went into the city and you know, replaced, you know, other strips of tenements. And the tenements are really only 3 or 4 stories tall, and huge, large spaces, really big flats with high ceilings. So in a sense, they're not, you know, perhaps making, you know, great use of kind of conservative of space, but they're lovely to live in. And also they're, you know, they're a beautiful kind of characteristic of the city. So when they did that though, you know, people moved into these high rises, and then loads of different kind of social problems started to arise, like as a consequence of that. And I mean, Britain is a very different context to Serbia. So, you know, it's a totally different culture. And I don't think we can make a direct comparison really, because the culture is very, very different. You know, Belgrade and Serbia are much more Mediterranean, in my opinion. And, you know, the cultural predisposition is very, very different. But even so, you know, subsequent to that, you know, even 10 years after, 15 years after, everyone sort of went, what have we done? You know, we've totally destroyed the city. And then, you know, they couldn't kind of undo this, if you like.
Exactly. And that's a thing with the urban planning and architectural design in general. It's like the long term, it's like eternal imprints that you're leaving in the city. You cannot just like go and popping up the ideas or designs that you think that will fit and make a solution for the problem. So it might bring a gentrification as a huge problem. You know, if you want to make the urban revitalization of the specific district, you might basically chase people from their neighborhood where they grew up to many generations. So that is what problem. On the other hand, if you have the reality, which is really kind of at the moment when the current government took the government, the reality was really bad. So you're not presenting Belgrade waterfront for the group of people of 1% as a solution, because that's offensive. You just don't do that. You should deal with the real problems. I really like, for example, the mayor of Tirana presented recently that they are trying to avoid, to deal with the housing and trying to avoid any kind of segregation and ghettoization of the city. So in each investment, the new investor has to provide 3% of total households to be a social housing. 3% is nothing, but it's a starting point, at least something. And I really liked it a lot. You know, as a policy, it really resonates with what I would, for example, do. But then he says, like, the next challenge is when you have this, and you mentioned it shortly, when you have this kind of new rebuilt buildings environment, now the costs of living are higher. So you need to find a balance for those who can afford it and those who are in the social flats and cannot afford it. So how do you rebalance this? And the market is basically dictating all these things. But at least it's some kind of step forward to some kind of transformation that we need.
Hvala Iva, ja sam samo malo pre zaboravila da napomenem, ako ne mogu da vidim sve učesnike u konverzaciji, ako neko ko je slušao želi da postavi neko pitanje ili da se uključi sa bilo kojim utiskom ili komentarom, to su naravno svi dobrodošli sada da urade.
Evo, mogu ja kojim slučajem?
Naravno.
I can speak in English, it's fine. I wanted to actually, while we were talking about the Belgrade waterfront, I am actually, let's say, a very close resident to it. So I would say that I'm an art historian, but I'm actually, by master degree, I'm a cultural anthropologist. So for me, all the other aspects of urban planning are actually what are really my point of focus. So whenever I pass by, of course, it was a very big problem for a very long time. But yes, it's made for that magical 1% that actually does not even exist in Serbia. I'm going to be honest. While you're entering Belgrade waterfront, there is actually a bus stop, and that bus stop doesn't take you anywhere else except suburbs. So it is actually a place where people who, let's say, aesthetically or financially or socially at the end do not belong in the so-called project. And it's very confusing. It's very confusing for them also. Also, the other problem occurs that obviously Belgrade waterfront was a very fast project, because everything else, despite Belgrade waterfront, stayed in its, let's say, natural habitat. The old train station, that's not a train station anymore, but it stayed there. It just got renovated just a little bit. The bus station is still there. All the aspects of life next to a bus station or a central train station are still there. And looking at what Belgrade waterfront wants to represent socially for that group of people is really not in accordance with what the rest of the neighborhood really lives for and lives in. And I think that's also the problem. I would call it forceful gentrification. It's very forceful. It's very fast. No, actually, the people who really live there are really not asked any questions. And I think it poses a very important problem. I mean, also other situations happen, for instance, in Vračar. Just one day, a 7-story building appears made out of new materials next to a house that was built in 1930. Or old houses are demolished without any question for the purpose of bigger buildings. I understand that we have a population problem. Let's say we've never decentralized our country. So everybody comes to the capital to live here. That poses a serious problem. And especially, I think, in urbanization terms, because where are we going to put those people? They all want to live in the city center, which is very weird because in most Western cultures, it's considered that you work in the center, but you live outside of the center, which makes more sense, let's be honest. But in the construction we live in today, it's kind of hard to implement without a very long and serious and, of course, well-financed plan. So I think those are the primary problems that, especially this part of town, Savamala, let's say, is actually being challenged with at the moment. And I'm afraid that many other old parts of town, or let's say the Ottoman Empire of Belgrade, so the old side, is going to face for a very long time until there's a proper plan and a proper agreement or among policymakers, politicians, and architects, of course, because they will be the ones implementing it. So I think we will need time for it in order will make sense.
Snezhana, I think what you're saying is very interesting, because actually it's so similar to what happened in Glasgow in Scotland, and interestingly it didn't happen in the capital city. They protected that, but they did it in the industrial city. And you know, exactly as you're sort of suggesting, you know, this idea that the surrounding community kind of doesn't know what to do with itself when these things kind of emerge like this. I mean, so much so that when I saw this, you know, at the beginning when they started building Belgrade and Water, and I remember it was a very, you know, aesthetically, it was a very, it made vivid kind of marks on my imagination. You know, my husband and I had cycled from our part of the city in Dorchel across all the way to Ada, you know, for a long time, for years. Mm-hmm. And at some point when they started to build this, you know, that the path got broken and broken and broken, but there was a period of time where they were putting, you know, new paths through and plowing. You know how there were all those old houses, those little small houses. I don't know, I think some of them were even occupied by like some Roma community. I'm not sure completely, but basically, you know, I remember a period of time when they pretty much flattened like everything. They'd ripped everything out except for there was one house kind of remaining, and there was like little old people living there, you know, going out, still had their little garden intact and their fence and so on. And it was like the last house with like this whole flat, you know, now dirt space, because they hadn't, you know, laid concrete yet at this point. And I just remember, you know, that image in my mind was like, there was something that seemed so inhumane about this process. And obviously—
Exactly, because the people are not asked. We also had, I believe everybody can remember here, the situation from 2008 when we were organizing Eurovision. And with the whole Carton City situation we had, and the forceful moving out of Roma people from New Belgrade to make it look more decent for Europe, to say so. So I think that those situations occur a lot of times.
That's a Western model. In fact, I would argue that most of these are Western models that have essentially moved across very regretfully. And, you know, it's very interesting. I mean, I'd like to go back to, you know, Ivanov's talk a little bit about Zlatibor, and you know, something that I felt when I was listening to this also is that, you know, in Serbia, and this is something I actually feel very passionately about, because I live here, half of my family is from here, and my daughter is growing up here. And, you know, here is one of the last places in Europe that you still have nature that is kind of wild and hasn't been interfered with. I mean, I know in Switzerland and many other countries that have pretty huge protected national parks and so on, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about wild nature that no one's interfered with, that no one's, you know, cut all the trees. Britain hasn't had that for centuries. You know, it's done there. It's a finished business, but here you still have the opportunity to protect your nature. And so, you know, again, I think that it's a really kind of critical moment when these kinds of things are happening. And you know, what Eva has mentioned about, you know, people coming together, and it's not enough as an architect or as a citizen to just kind of be thinking this on your own, that we really have a need desperately for unions of people to come together in kind of homogeneous thought, if you like. And I hope that these kind of discussions are going to be something that enhance, you know, our thinking around these kinds of issues, and that perhaps will draw more attention both locally and further afield to these issues. Because, you know, in a lot of countries, it's already finished, just like the idea of, you know, the bulldozing of old buildings. You know, it's the same with the natural environment as well. Once you take it away, you're never going to get it back.
There's no going back.
No. So, you know, it's a really critical moment. And I do actually believe that there's a huge population of people here who are very interested and adamant about protecting their green spaces, both in the urban context, but also, of course, in the natural environment as well, beyond the cities. And I do think it is really about this kind of coming together, which is something that, I think people are sort of slightly disheartened in this region, because there's been many moments where people tried to come together and it didn't work. But I think that, it's not the time to give up, really. And more attention is being, there's a unique, I still, I said this at the previous talk and I'll say it again. I think this is really a unique moment in time for Serbia, given the fact that for 2 years we've had this pandemic. But unlike many other countries where people have had, really limited kind of freedom, Serbia has practiced a lot of freedom. And I think this is really reflective of the culture here and how people think. And if we could thrust that into kind of more momentum in terms of actually action and collective action to kind of combat some of these forces, I think that it could be very, very powerful. Unfortunately, there are these movements going on around the world. And I think that, there's a big kind of opening in terms of consciousness of people's individual position and their contribution to these kinds of issues. So, I really am thankful to Jelena for initiating these kinds of conversations on these topics, because I think it's really invaluable. And it's a really poignant and sort of fragile moment to be having these conversations. So
no, indeed, I completely agree with the sentiment of your speech, because that is something we all strive for, especially in humanities. That is something we care for, the community, societies, that is our occupation. And I do agree to the fact that there are initiatives just emerging from everywhere. But I think that unfortunately at this particular moment, they're still only in the stage of, let's say, they're vocal, but they're kind of, let's say, common discourse. So they're a coffee table talk. So I think that the problem occurs of actually implementing sustainability, not only environmental sustainability as a global term, into everyday discourse, into understanding how actually sustainability works on every layer and level of everyday life. I think that is the step we're missing into really taking action. Because when someone in Serbia says sustainability, we always think about ecology. We always think about something green, it's the environment. Nobody thinks about technological sustainability, cultural sustainability, artistic sustainability. We don't take those things into account because the way the narrative has been sprung upon us is actually mostly in the environmental way. So until we really learn the full meaning of the vast word sustainability, I'm afraid that we won't take its full potential as much as we can, because we obviously have at least the natural resources for it. But until we don't completely understand it, I don't think there's going to be a speed up in the process.
This is a kind of key term in tonight's talks. I mean, this theme of momentum, and I don't take that lightly. I think it's a very important idea and kind of feeling, if you like. I'm wondering, for everyone here tonight, if in the context of Serbia currently, what would it take to create that kind of essentially coming together, that union, that ability for people to actually, not just think, but actually act, and act unanimously? What do you think would be needed in order to spur something like that and to keep the momentum going, so that it's not these, small, I'm absolutely not criticizing the people who've gone out into the street even recently and demonstrated about various different environmental issues and other aspects of society that have been going on recently. I'm absolutely not. I mean, that's a start, but what people expend their energy, they go out into the street, and where does that go? And I'm really curious as to what would create a kind of consistent momentum whereby we actually get a result. People get angry enough and loud enough and consistent enough and forceful enough that they actually get a result. What would I would that here?
In Serbia, sincerely, the Rio Tinto demonstrations were actually a very good starting point, because of course ecology and sustainability have been a present topic in the last 15 years in general. We've been talking about it, but yeah, okay. It's there, but it's there. But Rio Tinto was obviously something that ignited a big revolt in the Serbian people. And as much as it had, let's say, juridical consequences, I would say that it was a very good starting point. Obviously, in our history, everything starts with a fight and everything starts with an uprising, and that's just the type of nation we are. And if we have to implement it into contemporary society, we will obviously do it. I just hope less violently. And I think that maybe even if it didn't significantly make a change on a, let's say, local or national level, I believe that in many people's minds, it made a change on an individual level. So they started getting interested about what Rio Tinto is, what are they doing, why are people angry about it, why are they protesting in the middle of the highway on a Saturday when people are going on a picnic, why is this so important? And maybe even it makes little other micro changes. For instance, okay, now they read about Rio Tinto, but what are the other problems? We had also a problem with the building of hydroelektrane. I'm sorry, I lost the word in English for a moment. So there was also then awareness about hydro energy. How are they exploiting it in Serbia? How are we going to tackle this problem? Also, we had a problem of pollution of rivers and the pollution of water. It is something that we have become more aware of in the meantime. And I sincerely hope that maybe all those things have at least inspired 10% of the population to, for instance, start recycling. Because that is where it actually begins, let's say, in that aspect. And maybe recycling would lead to actually maybe donating some money for a good cause for sustainability, or even getting personally engaged, calling your friends one day, you all sit in a car, go to the other river, and you go and pick up garbage from it. And I think that in Serbia, it all starts from a major revolt. And later on, you can see the individual consequences or actually results in the microcosmos of the individual rather than on the macrocosmos.
If you agree, my ladies, without gentlemen, right now, I will conclude official part of the conference in English. On behalf of ŠumArt Association, I would like to express my appreciation to all panelists for their valuable contribution to our fourth online conference, Challenges of the Contemporary Momentum, Architecture Milestone. My deepest gratitude goes to esteemed Dr. Iva Čukić, Mrs. Jelena Gačić-Ivanov, respected Dr. Bo Hanley for their excellent thought-provoking talk, Professor Perić for his outstanding journey through timeless Belgrade, and my dear colleagues, Mrs. Smilka Čabraja and Nataša Tapić, online conference coordinators for their organizing questions, answers, and discussion, keeping things under control and reasonably on time. However, most importantly, I would like to thank you all who attended the conference and helped make it such a successful event. Thank you very much. There is no doubt left that organizing an online conference on these very important topics is much needed, especially after the well-known situation and everything that befell us in 2020 and later, and all challenges of the contemporary architecture proceeding today. There were a number of specific questions raised during each panel talk, and I believe it may need online conferences in the future. I hope that you all agree with me. We are obliged to identify new knowledge to build a new foundation, so our collaboration will continue in the next period. I agree with all of panelists, but I must emphasize that education, especially non-formal, is one of the utmost importance. So we are announcing a new webinars on the topics of today's conference intended for a wider audience that will be held on the fall. My esteemed colleagues and I are working on that issue. Therefore, a good place to start building a sustainable ecosystem for the future world be recognition that there is no infrastructure more fundamental than a culture, no form of capital investment more productive than investment in the human capital, and no better place to start policy planning than by looking at Serbian youth assets and capabilities rather than its needs. Let me conclude by assuring you all that ŠumArt full and unwavering support for research for young and all other researchers and visual artists in overcoming all challenges of their part to creating a better, sustainable and innovative environment to foster the development of society in the future. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Jelena. I also didn't get a chance to thank you, Natasha and Smilka. Your contributions were really important and helped so much in terms of the way that, thank you so much for speaking in English firstly, and also for outlining, some of the content of today's lectures. So that was incredibly helpful, and probably, I don't know, but we may have international listeners listening to this talk. So,
we will.
I'm sure that will be helpful to them as well.
Thank you very much.